Chapter 12. Anne. Mr. Carrisford had fainted from the shock of finally encountering Sara. When he regained consciousness, he looked around wildly to see her, and then fell back against his chair in relief when he glimpsed her sitting near Ramdas and the monkey. "I am so sorry, Sara, darling," he wept as he held out his arms to her. "I am not a wicked man. I have been punished for my foolishness. I have sent Mr. Carmichael to the far corners of the earth looking for you. Thank heavens we have found you at last, my little girl in the right-hand attic," he murmured as he hugged her to him. With one hand he fished in the breast pocket of his robe. He pulled out Sara's note of thanks. He had been keeping it close to his heart. "It was you who brought the magic?" Sara said, looking at him in astonishment. "It was you who brought the magic?" Sara said, looking at him in astonishment. "I could not have done it without Ramdas. He told me about you. We figured out together this way of helping you. It was Ramdas who was strong and agile and quiet enough to get the things I chose for you into your room. But why did you do it?" "I did it for Sara Crewe's sake. I had no idea that you were Sara Crewe, but I could not stand the thought of another poor, penniless girl struggling without anyone to help or care for her. In my delirium, after my terrible bout with brain fever, I had left my friend's only daughter in that perilous, penniless state." "Then it is you who are my friend," Sara cried, throwing her arms around Mr. Carrisford's neck. "You and Ramdas. You have been a true friend to my father." Sara kissed her friend lovingly on the cheek. "The man will be himself again in a matter of weeks," predicted Mr. Carmichael. "You can see the difference in his face already." In fact, Tom Carrisford did indeed look and feel like a new man. There were many things to think of and to plan. Sara was not to return to the seminary at all. He was adamant about that. Mr. Carmichael was to draft a letter to Miss Minchin explaining in legal terms all that had happened and outlining Sara's changed fortunes. Becky was to be sent next door to the townhouse, where Mr. Carrisford proposed to hire her as Sara's personal maid and companion. No more pots to scrub, and plenty to eat. Moreover, Miss Minchin must be informed that any girl from the seminary whom Sara considered a friend was to be allowed to visit Sara at her home next door. If Miss Minchin objected to any of this, she was to be told that to mistreat or to otherwise interfere in the happiness of Sara Crewe, heiress of millions from their covered diamond mines, would surely reflect badly on her seminary. The parents of Miss Crewe's friends were not likely to refuse invitations to visit her at her guardian's house. Stories of the shameful way Miss Minchin had treated her former charity pupil would be circulated by Mr. Carrisford to all these parents, if necessary. In a month's time, Tom Carrisford had fully recovered from his illness and his depression. He had never met anyone he liked quite as much as he loved his adopted daughter, Sara. There were so many charming things for the magicians of the house to do to surprise and delight her. There might be beautiful fresh flowers to place in her room, or small gifts to tuck under her pillows. Once, as they sat together in the evening, they heard the scratch of a heavy paw on the door. When Sara went to find out what it was, there stood an enormous dog, a splendid Russian boarhound, wearing a collar bearing the words, "I am Boris. I serve the Princess Sara." The hours when Sara and the Indian gentleman sat alone reading or talking had a special charm of their own. One evening, as Mr. Carrisford looked up from his book, he saw that his companion sat gazing into the fire. "What are you supposing, Sara?" he inquired. "I was supposing," she said. "I was remembering that hungry day, and a child I saw outside." "But there were a great many hungry days. Which one was it?" "The day the magic first came." Then Sara told her guardian the story of the bakery, and of the fourpence she picked out of the mud, and the beggar child. She told it quite simply, and in as few words as possible. "I was also supposing a kind of plan," she continued. "I was thinking I would like to do something." "And what would that be?" asked Mr. Carrisford, curious. "You may do anything you like." "I was wondering," said Sara shyly. "I was wondering if I could go to see the bud woman and tell her that when hungry children, particularly on those dreadfully cold days, come sit on her steps or look in the window, if she would just call them in and feed them, and then she could send the bills to me. Could I do that?" "You shall do it tomorrow morning." "Thank you. You see, I know what it is to be hungry. It is very hard when you cannot even pretend your hunger away." The next morning, a carriage drew up before the door of Brown's bakery. Its occupants descended just as Mrs. Brown was putting a tray of smoking hot buns into the window display. She looked at Sara closely as she entered her shop, and then her good-natured face lit up in recognition. "I'm sure that I remember you, miss," she exclaimed, "and yet—" "You once gave me 6 buns for 4 pence. Today's special," Sara said, winking. "And you gave 5 of them to a beggar child. I've always remembered it. I beg your pardon, sir," she said, turning to Mr. Carrisford. "But there aren't many young people who notice a hungry face in that way. Excuse the liberty, miss. But you look rosier and, well, better, healthier, than you did that day." "I am better, thank you," Sara replied, "and I am much happier, too. I have come to ask you to do something for me, if you would be so kind." "Me, miss? Why, bless you! Yes, miss. What can I do?" Sara made her proposal concerning the dreadful days and the hungry children and the hot meals. "Why, bless me," Mrs. Brown said at the end, "it will be a pleasure to me to do it. I am a working woman myself. I just can't afford to do much on my own account, and there are loads of poor folk everywhere you turn. But, if you'll excuse me for saying so, I'm bound to say that I've given away many a bit of bread since that afternoon, just thinking of you, how wet and cold you were, how hungry you looked, and yet you gave away your hot buns as if you were a princess." "That little girl was even hungrier than I was," Sara protested, blushing at Mrs. Brown's compliment. She was, indeed. She was starving. Many's the time she's told me of it since, how she sat there in the wet as if a wolf were tearing her poor young insides. "Oh, have you seen her since then?" Sara asked eagerly. "Do you know where she is?" "Why, she's in that back room, miss. She has been with me for a month, and a decent, well-meaning girl she's going to turn out. Such a help to me in the shop and in the kitchen as you'd hardly believe, knowing how she'd lived before. You see, I told her to come when she was hungry, and when she'd come I'd give her odd jobs to do. The end of it was, I've given her a job and a home. She helps me and behaves well, and is as thankful as a girl can be. Her name's Anne. She has no other." Anne came shyly from the back room and stood next to Sara. The children stood and looked at each other for a few minutes. "I am so glad," Sara said. "Perhaps Mrs. Brown will let you be the one to give the buns to feed the children." "Yes, miss. I'd like to do that," Sara replied. And somehow, Sara felt as if Anne understood her, though she said so little, and only stood still and looked after her as she went out of the shop. The end.